Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my short series where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women around the world who are doing important work. My name is Emily Prey and I'm the director of the Gender Policy Portfolio at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. And today I'm speaking with my friend Meghan Bodette, the director of research at the Kurdish Peace Institute, which she also co-founded, about the Iran protests which were sparked by the death of a young Kurdish Iranian woman named Jina Masa Amini. Thank you so much for joining me, Meghan.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
So tell me about the origins of the Woman Life Freedom, the chant that has become synonymous with the women-led protests in Iran.
Of course, yeah. So this slogan originates in the Kurdish women's movement that developed in Turkey and in Northeast Syria over the past 3 to 4 decades. So initially, within the Kurdish national liberation struggle in Turkey, like in other national liberation movements and revolutionary movements and conflict environments around the world, women had a role, and the conflict atmosphere gave them new opportunities to participate both in armed struggle and in civil society. However, they still faced barriers to full equality and participation, both as a result of state oppression that they faced as Kurds and as women in Turkey, and as a result of patriarchy in their communities. But women in the Kurdish movement sort of defied the historical trend in that they were able to take the new opportunities they gained as activists, organizers, politicians, and fighters because of the conflict and the political movement, and organize within those spaces in order to gain a higher level of participation and make women's liberation a central facet of the Kurdish national movement. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that became more formalized, and the official ideological program of the Kurdish movement in Turkey came to view women's liberation as central to all other forms of liberation and to see women as the revolutionary subject. So you had that idea that a society couldn't be free without women's freedom, as it was very famously put by Abdullah Öcalan, the founder of the PKK, the armed Kurdish movement in Turkey. And Kurdish women in that movement really developed that by forming armed women's units, by establishing autonomous all women's political structures. Throughout the 2000s, you saw women bringing this into civilian, legal pro-Kurdish politics in Turkey. And then in 2011, with the Syrian uprising, Kurdish women in Syria, who were very influenced by this Kurdish political movement, were able to take these innovations and build on these theoretical frameworks and the practical work of the women before them to put that into practice. And obviously, what happens in one part of the Kurdish inhabited regions of the Middle East impacts other Kurdish regions. So Iranian Kurdish women, in addition to having a long history of activism and political participation and participation in armed resistance of their own, were very much inspired by the achievements of Kurdish women in Turkey and in Syria. Many Iranian Kurdish women actually joined groups like the YPJ in Northeast Syria to fight against ISIS, and participated in Northeast Syria's all-women's political structures as well, contributing both to building Kurdish autonomy and fighting for women's liberation as a central part of that. So there was a lot of history of Kurdish women's organizing locally in Iran's Kurdish regions, and Kurdish women there were very inspired by what their sisters on the other side of the border did. And so this came from that long history of Kurdish organizing for autonomy and self-determination, and for Kurdish women's efforts to center women's liberation at the center of that. And we have to remember, these protests began in Kurdish cities in Iran, spread from there, and the Kurdish regions have seen some of the most sustained demonstrations. So that's where it came from. And because of that sort of universalist sentiment that it has, that it represents this idea that a society can't be free if women aren't free, it caught on very quickly in a country like Iran, where the entire oppressive ruling establishment that oppresses ethnic minorities, religious minorities, women, working class people, all kinds of disadvantaged segments of society, that system has misogynist control over women's bodies and lives at its very center. In its legal system, the dress code and mandatory hijab are just the tip of the iceberg there. So it made sense for people in Iran that to fight an authoritarian regime based on the oppression of women, that you had to center women's liberation.
It's really important to have this background, this historical context when we're looking at what's happening. So thank you for providing
Yeah.
that. And so now, how has Iran's long oppressed Kurdish population been affected by the protests that are going on?
So we have, from the very beginning of the protest movement, which did begin in Kurdish regions, as I mentioned, seen a disproportionate amount of violence and repression in Kurdish areas, as well as in other areas populated by ethnic minorities like the Baluch provinces on the other side of the country. So ethnic minorities have been hit the hardest in Kurdish regions. Iranian forces used live ammunition on protesters. They raided people's houses. They've arrested, hundreds, if not thousands of people. At the Kurdish Peace Institute, we were able to publish accounts from people, who were on the ground in the region talking about a real pervasive climate of fear, and yet an insistence on demonstrating anyway, despite threats of imprisonment, execution, military force being used against demonstrators, and all kinds of oppression. Notably, in Kurdish regions in Iran, this isn't new. Kurds in these regions have been rising up against the Iranian state since actually before the establishment of the Islamic Republic, because as many people know, the monarchy was just as oppressive to the Kurdish population of Iran and just as nationalistic as the Islamic Republic now is. So there's a long tradition of Kurdish uprisings and political organization in Iran that made these areas, even though they were subjected to some of the harshest repression, able to sustain some of the most widespread demonstrations, labor strikes, women's activism, and all of these other forms of political engagement that we've been seeing. So you have very heavy repression, but you also have a real revolutionary movement, and that society is rising up. Women's liberation is at the center, like in Turkey, like in Syria, like in Iraq. It's still a very patriarchal region, so that's challenging established social norms. All, men and women together are protesting for women's liberation. Men are supporting women who do things like removing their headscarves and, taking other symbolic actions. And the ability of Kurds to sustain these protests and really demand not just a new form of government, but a real democracy that respects minority rights, that's decentralized, that provides a democratic system that guarantees women's liberation. That's really sustained both the protests and their revolutionary character. So that's what's been going on. Heavy repression and very central resistance that shows little sign of letting up.
And we know that we can't have democracy without already having a foundation of women's rights and human rights. It's not the other way around that democracy creates these things. It's the foundation of gender equity, gender equality, human rights that allows for more stable and robust democracies to grow.
Absolutely.
And now this is something that's very near and dear to my heart, because back in November, there was a CNN investigation into how Iran's security forces are using rape to quell the protests by sexually assaulting protesters, both in the streets, but especially in detention centers. And victims are not just women and girls, they are men and boys too. I don't think this is getting the attention that it deserves. So how should the US be responding to this, especially given that our government recently announced an update to its national strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally, and released a presidential memorandum to promote accountability for conflict-related sexual violence?
Absolutely. And it's very important that you bring that up, because that is one of the many atrocities that the Iranian regime has been committing against its population, particularly against its minority populations. This is something that many Kurds were very afraid of, because sexual and gender-based violence has often been a tool used by repressive regimes like Turkey and Iran and extremist groups like ISIS against Kurdish populations. So this was a fear that these communities had, and that reporting showed that it was very well justified that this is happening. So one, it's essential that there is documentation that is centered on respecting survivors' wishes and ensuring that they're not re-traumatized. because the perpetrators of these abuses have names and addresses, and they can be held accountable. We've seen related to atrocities in Syria, including sexual and gender-based violence, prosecutions in Europe, other kinds of international prosecutions that have begun to, hold perpetrators accountable, and doing something like that for Iran is going to be essential. So there needs to be support for documentation and responsibly done documentation. And then I would say also that the US needs to step up its efforts to help refugees, both those who leave Iran and go to other parts of the region. There's already been a lot of reports of people crossing the border to Iraqi Kurdistan, people leaving to perhaps Europe or the US as well, and providing support for these survivors if they do and when they do choose to leave, so that they're not remaining in these countries, and for their families as well, because we know that one thing that the Iranian regime does is that even when some people are able to make it out of the country, they will target families who remain. So giving people opportunities to get out and get the help that they need when they do, also going to be very important. And in general, in messaging, making it clear that in this case, with this protest movement, that these atrocities are still going on, that they're not over, and that condemnations will include efforts to hold perpetrators accountable and protect survivors, not simply statements saying that we condemn this. Because in terms of US policy on conflict-related sexual violence, on these kinds of human rights abuses in the Middle East and elsewhere, we hear a lot that the US condemns it, but we don't always see enough action to help survivors get support and justice. And really, this needs to be looked at in the political context of what's going on. These people are being subjected to these and other gross human rights violations because they are demanding a free and democratic society based on gender equality, on ethnic and religious equality, on all of these values that very brave people in Kurdish regions of Iran and across the country as well have been fighting for months now through these demonstrations. So holding on to the fact that this is being done because these people have these values and because they're insisting on this change and these basic rights, and doing what is possible to be done to empower them and disempower and hold accountable perpetrators of all kinds of abuses against protesters, that's going to be very important.
Thoughts and prayers and condemnations are simply not enough for victims and survivors of sexual violence. Yeah,
they're not.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Meghan, for coming back onto Gender and Geopolitics. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for speaking about the Iran protests and especially how it's affecting the Kurdish populations.
Of course, thank you for calling attention to these essential issues and keeping an eye on this story and the bravery of these people who are in the streets to this day.
Thanks.